Well, ahoy there, mates, and welcome to the Pirates of the Golden Age of Piracy. Very well, let's set sail. Now, I've been engaged in living history since about 1971, doing all types of things: Rev War, Renaissance Fair, pirates, gunfighters, mountain man rendezvous. And when I decided to get into pirate reenacting, I quickly realized that most of the books on the market were terribly incorrect. So in researching living history of pirates, I decided to write my own book, A Pirate's Life in the Golden Age of Piracy, the true non-fiction history of the pirates of the Golden Age. And if you're interested, of course, you can get a copy at the Eckert Barnes & Noble College Bookstore, or you can always contact me at my website, www.robertjacobauthor.com. All right, the Golden Age of Piracy. I put that from about 1630 to 1722. And during our class, we are going to discuss a lot of the historical facts. But we're also going to discuss misconceptions and myths about pirates. And most of those came from two books that were written during the Golden Age of Piracy. And both of those books were filled with so many inaccuracies that they have been repeated even down to this day. Here's a classic example. You've all heard of Blackbeard the Pirate, and you may probably think that Blackbeard tortured and killed most of his captives, that he sank all the prize ships that he took, that he was married 14 times. In fact, they say that after he finished with each wife, he would give her to his crew, and when they finished with her, they threw her overboard. That he stayed in the waters of the Caribbean, and that he was the most feared pirate on the seas for many years. He was even feared by his crew and killed many of them at will. None of those are true. So let's get to the real story. We start with the Spanish Main, the Caribbean. Now, it was called the Spanish Main mainly because it belonged to Spain. The first island was settled by Christopher Columbus in 1494 on his second trip to the New World. This is the island he named Hispaniola. 2 years later, his brother actually became governor of Hispaniola and founded the capital city of Santo Domingo. Santo Domingo, of course, is still there today. And it was the capital city of all of the Spanish Main up until 1821. Now, from there, they launched expeditions to attack the Aztecs in Mexico. Then they launched expeditions to pretty much conquer most of the islands in the Caribbean. They established a major port in Havana, which was their major seaport in the Caribbean. And the relationship between Santo Domingo and Havana was similar to the relationship between Washington, D.C. and New York City, with Havana being the major port, but the capital is still at Santo Domingo. Now, those arrows represent the direction of the wind. Now, sailing ships have a great deal of difficulty sailing directly into the wind. So really, the only way to leave the Caribbean was right along the Florida Straits, where the wind was hitting the sides of your ships, and you could get up above the wind before you made your turn back towards Europe. There was an alternate route called the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, but that was very difficult to do because you had to zigzag back and forth to fight your way up towards the direction of the wind. Now, one of the main cities in the Spanish Main was Panama on the Pacific side. All of the gold from the Incas and the silver mined from Bolivia would be shipped to Panama, as well as all the pearls, jewels, and spices gathered from the China Seas. And they would be shipped across the ocean, probably once every month, on ships that would all head to Panama. From Panama, the gold would be taken across the isthmus in mule caravans to the city of Portobello. All the gold from the Aztecs would be taken to Veracruz, and all of the rich resources from what would later become Venezuela would be taken to Maracaibo. All of this would be shipped to Santo Domingo for accounting and record keeping, as the Spanish were very good at. And then from there, all of this would be taken to Havana. Now, this would happen throughout the year, and all of the merchandise would be stored at Havana in one big warehouse. And once a year, it would be all taken back to Spain in a huge Spanish treasure fleet. Some of these Spanish treasure fleets actually sank in hurricanes. You may have heard of the Atocha. That was a member of a Spanish treasure fleet that sank off of Key West in 1622. Now, mostly everyone stayed out of the Spanish Main. Occasionally, a few English privateers managed to work their way in. This is Sir Francis Drake. Most have heard of Sir Francis Drake, who attacked the Spanish gold caravan in 1572. He also attacked Santo Domingo and St. Augustine. But except for these few occasional attacks, the Spanish Main primarily remained in Spanish control. That all changed in 1625. Europe was going through a terrible war called the 30 Years' War. It's well named because the war lasted for 30 years. And there were a lot of refugees fleeing Europe looking to get away from the oppression. The 30 Years' War was primarily Catholics against Protestants. So if you were a Protestant in an area that was taken by the Catholic-controlled armies, you needed to leave. And a lot of those people started settling on the outer islands of the Caribbean, mainly English Puritans, French Huguenots, and Dutch. They also settled on the island of Santo Domingo on the north coast. And the first main capital was Barbados. Now, on the island of Hispaniola, they made their living selling pork barbecue. The island was a hunter's paradise. Pigs that had been living wild and breeding for 100 years since Columbus first brought them over were very rampant on the island and could be easily hunted. So the first inhabitants looked something like that with their muskets. Now, they cooked these pigs in a technique they learned from the Taino Indians. They would dig a pit and cover the coals in the pit with wet, spiced leaves that made a lot of flavorful smoke. Then they would cook and smoke the meat suspended on racks above the fire. In the Taino language, this technique was called Buccaneer. So these early hunters became known as Buccaneers. They would set up little shops along the beach and sell to other settlers from some of the other colonies. And if by chance they see a Spanish ship sail by, they could simply pack up and disappear into the vast jungles of the island. Well, the Spanish became very annoyed by this. So by 1629, they brought in a heavyweight. He was one of their #1 generals, Frederic de Toledo, and he launched a campaign to attack all of the settlements in the Caribbean that did not belong to Spain. You can see the picture here of all of his troops landing ashore and burning and destroying some poor village. He attacked the Dutch at St. Martin's. He attacked the Buccaneers on Hispaniola. He attacked St. Kitts. And all of these refugees fled to a small island of Tortuga on the north shore of Hispaniola. They felt that from this island they could defend themselves against the Spanish and had a better chance of surviving. They built up the island with forts and all types of protection. And during the 1630s, they realized we could make more money taking Spanish ships than selling barbecue. So the Buccaneers transitioned to a pirate culture and became known as the Buccaneers. But were they pirates? Technically, yes, but that's not how the other nations of Europe looked at them. The English, the Dutch, and the French were absolutely delighted that these buccaneers were operating out of Tortuga. You see, they kept the Spanish busy, and it kept them away from their settlements and allowed their settlements on the Lesser Antilles to flourish. Then in the 1640s, Tortuga became an official French colony with an appointed governor. And the first thing the governor did was import 1,650 ladies, if you know what I mean, to keep the pirates somewhat occupied and happy. And it worked. For a while, Tortuga took on the exact look you see in all of the Hollywood movies. Large forts, a governor friendly towards pirates, lots of buccaneers, and lots of very friendly buccaneer ladies. In 1648, this began to change. The war, the 30 Years' War in Europe, was finally over. And thousands of professionally trained soldiers and mercenaries were out of work. Well, they all wanted to get rich, and they saw Tortuga as a great opportunity. So they flooded to the island. Now these buccaneers took on more of a regimental military look. They looked like soldiers, not hunters. They fought with well-trained tactics. They were highly effective at what they did, and they became the fiercest group in the Caribbean. This is when the Brethren of the Coast started to develop. The partnerships and friendships among all of these buccaneers on Tortuga. And they actually started coming up with documents, rules on how they were going to be pirates, called the Chasse Partie of buccaneers. So you've heard me talk about pirates, but another word is very important to understand, and that's the word of privateer. There is a difference. Privateers are legal. You see, many nations did not have very large navies, so they kept their enemies at bay by issuing letters of marque to private citizens known as privateers. These were legally allowed to attack ships listed in their letters of marque. So, for example, if England was having trouble with Spain, they would issue letters of marque allowing those people to attack Spanish ships. They couldn't attack anybody that wasn't listed on those letters of marque, but they were certainly allowed to attack the ships that were listed. The deal was they gave 25% of their take back to the government. Well, this was a great deal. You keep your enemy at bay, you generate a fairly substantial revenue from a bunch of privateer ships that were virtually free. You didn't have to pay to build ships. You didn't have to pay their salaries. It literally cost you a piece of paper. So if it was such a good deal, why become a pirate, which had no letters of marque? Well, first of all, there's that 25% that you've got to give to the government. What if you didn't want to give it to them? You turn pirate. And then the letters gave you limits on who you could attack. If the letters only allowed you to attack Spanish ships, but you saw a French ship you wanted to take, you turned pirate. And then there's also peacetime when no letters of marque were being issued. Many privateers had to become pirates when they couldn't get letters of marque anymore. Now, in January 1655, the power base in the Caribbean changed significantly. England decided they wanted a piece of the action. So they took William Penn, the father of William Penn of Pennsylvania, with 34 ships, 7,000 Marines, 6,000 soldiers and 120 cavalry, and his orders were to take Santo Domingo. He landed his troops and started to march towards the city, but he was ambushed by a force of 2,400 Spanish soldiers, and they were repelled back to their boats. Well, now what do? You can't go back to England to failure, so he looked around for another island to take, one that was less defended, and he found it, Jamaica, who almost had no soldiers. He easily took the island of Jamaica, raised the British flag, and Jamaica became a British colony ever since. Now, they were very much afraid of Spanish counterattacks. So what do you do to keep the Spanish away? That job fell to a man named Christopher Mings, who I bet you've never heard of. Christopher Mings sailed to Tortuga and recruited Buccaneer crews and built large fleets of ships to attack Spanish ports everywhere. He attacked Spanish all along the South America coast and in Cuba. Now, he didn't take ships at sea. He landed his forces and took cities from the shore. Amphibious operations. Christopher Mings, you might say, was kind of a marine, so to speak. He got the title the Pirate King. But there's an interesting fact about Christopher Mings. He happened to have been an admiral in the British Navy. He was sent by Great Britain under orders to organize the pirates and privateers and buccaneers on Tortuga into pirate fleets to keep the Spanish busy. Eventually, he was recalled to England, and he was replaced by one of his young proteges, a man by the name of Henry Morgan. Now, Henry Morgan came to Port Royal in 1655 with the original invasion fleet. In fact, he was a lieutenant in the army, very well connected. His father was a general, his uncle was a general, and he happened to be engaged to the governor's daughter. So he was an ideal person to fulfill Christopher Mings' shoes. Just as Christopher Mings did, he would always start his operations by sailing to Tortuga to recruit buccaneers. And between 1663 and 1665, he attacked Spanish ports all throughout the Caribbean and kept the Spanish at bay. Now, was he a pirate or a privateer? He was definitely a privateer. He always had letters of marque from the governor, who was also one of his best friends. He operated under those letters of marque, attacking Spanish ships and cities, but only Spanish ships and cities. And even though Spain and England were not at war, this was very common. The Spanish privateers were doing the same thing to the English ports. Then in 1665, a war broke out between the Dutch and the English. Now remember, most of those buccaneers were English, Dutch, and French. And France started off on the side of the Dutch, and then halfway through the war, switched to the side of the English. Can you imagine what that did to the relationship of the buccaneers? Who do they go with? Must have been a very difficult time for the buccaneers to know who their friends were and who their enemies were. Now in the north, buccaneer raids started occurring outside of the Caribbean. The Dutch attacked Hampton, Virginia, and raided plantations all along the James River. The English retaliated by attacking the Dutch colony in New Amsterdam, and they took it and kept it, and renamed that colony New York. In 1668, the war was over, and Henry Morgan was looking to take another big prize. This time, it would be Portobello, right there. He attacked the city, and you can see that contemporary print of Henry Morgan sacking Portobello, and came back with 250,000 pieces of eight. That's about $25 million in today's money. That was 7 times the annual gross national product of the island of Jamaica. It was also each individual person's wage for that one operation would be 3 times what they could make back home. So what are pieces of eight? Well, the Spanish denomination, they had 2 versions, silver coins and gold coins. The silver coins came in 1 reale, 2 reale, 4 reale, and 8 reale versions. The gold coins came in 1 escudos, 2 escudos, 4 escudos, and 8 escudos. Each coin being twice as valuable as the coin before it. Well, the 1 escudos coin was worth twice the value of the 8 reale coin, which is why some people started calling them doubloons. Double, get it? Now, the 8 reale coin was also the same silver weight as the Dutch dollar. The Dutch were very good traders, but you always have that problem when you're exchanging currency from one country to another. So the Dutch came up with a coin that exactly matched the Spanish 8 reale coin, identical weight in silver, and they called it the Dulder. This was difficult for English to say, so they started calling it the dollar. And consequently, the Spanish 8 reale coin eventually became known as the Spanish dollar. Now, when they went to make change, if they didn't have the exact change, they would quite often literally just cut the coin up into little pieces, like a pizza. An 8 reale coin given to buy something worth 4 reales, you might simply cut it in half. These were called bits. A 2 reale bit, 4 reale bit. Think about the expression, 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits, a dollar. That's where that came from. Now, the English coins were based upon the penny or the pence. They had the 6-pence coin, the shilling, which was worth 12 pence, a half crown, a crown worth 60 pence, and the guinea worth 240 pence. The guinea was their only golden coin, and it was called the guinea because most of the gold for that coin came from Africa, and Africa at that time was called the Guinea Coast. So how do the English coins compare with the Spanish coins? Well, the shilling was worth about $20 in today's money. You can't really look at the value of silver and try and equate it today. The buying power is a lot different. But I use what I call the rum standard. With 1 shilling, you could buy a bottle of rum back then. And a decent bottle of rum costs about 20 bucks today. With a 2 reale coin, you could buy a good bottle of rum, which would cost about $25 today. So pieces of 8, using that rationale, would equal about $100. So what did he do with all the money that he got? Henry Morgan went and bought himself a ship, a 34-gun ship called the Oxford. This would have been the most powerful ship in the Caribbean. And he sailed to the Isla de Vaca. That was another favorite recruiting place of Henry Morgan's, just south of the island of Hispaniola. He didn't want to make the trip all the way up to Tortuga. He stopped off there. And while he was recruiting and partying and drinking, the Oxford kind of blew up. Apparently, someone was just careless with matches down in the powder room. Most of the crew were killed. Henry Morgan miraculously was blown into the water unharmed and managed to swim to another ship. The next venture they had was the venture of Maracaibo in what is today Venezuela. Maracaibo was a fairly rich port. All of the resources, mainly agricultural, came to Maracaibo from Venezuela for transport eventually back. But there was normally a lot of cash to be had in that city. 2 years earlier, the French Buccaneer Hollandaise took Maracaibo and made a fortune. Unfortunately, Hollandaise didn't get to spend it. A few weeks later, while he was sailing around the coast of Venezuela, his ship sank in a storm, and he made it ashore, but he was captured by natives, and he and an entire crew were eaten. So as Henry Morgan approached Maracaibo, he noticed a fort firing shots at him. That's bad. How is he going to get past that fort? So Henry landed his troops on shore and went through the jungle to attack the fort from behind. But the Spanish realized what Henry Morgan was doing, and they piled up all their explosives in a room and set a fuse and vacated the fort. Luckily, Henry Morgan's men saw it and managed to stamp out the fire before it blew up. He passed the fort safely. He attacked the city of Maracaibo and got a reasonable amount of money. Then he sailed down south and took the city of Gibraltar and got even some more money. But when he was about to leave, he saw something that alarmed him. 3 large Spanish warships, the Santa Luisa, the Marquesa, and the Magdalena. Well, how's he going to get past them? Morgan came up with a plan. He took one of his older ships, the Satisfaction, and 12 brave volunteers. Now, he loaded the deck of that ship with explosives, and then, sounds a bit crazy, but he dressed the explosives to look like pirates, so that from a distance, it looked like the deck was filled with pirates. Now, the plan was that they were to sail the Satisfaction right at one of the largest of the Spanish warships, and just before it hit, light the fuse of the explosives, and then jump overboard and swim to one of the other vessels. All right, so here it goes. There goes the Satisfaction towards the Magdalena, and it crashed into it and blew up. The ship was on fire. Then Morgan's ships managed to maneuver and capture the Santa Luisa on a sandbar and fired volleys into it until it caught on fire and captured the Marquesa intact. There is a contemporary sketch of Maracaibo, the Battle of Maracaibo, showing the Satisfaction blowing up one ship and seeing the other ships burning. He only got 35,000 pieces of eight from the whole venture, but it was enough to pay the bills. Now, leaving, there was that fort again. How was he going to get past it this time? Well, the very clever Henry Morgan devised another ingenious plan. He took several of his men and had them row ashore in boats all day long, and they would cover themselves with blankets and row back, then lift the blankets off and row ashore. So from a distance, it looked like Henry Morgan was unloading his entire crew for a land attack, when really it was only the same group of sailors rowing back and forth. Then in that evening, he ordered his men to light huge bonfires to appear that his force had landed, and then he ordered a drunken rowdiness to commence. His men started shooting muskets in the air, yelling, screaming, hooping, and that alerted the Spanish. The Spanish repositioned all their guns to repel a land attack. Then they launched all their troops through the jungle at night, ready to ambush the drunken pirates as they lay asleep on the beach. Henry's men simply rowed back to the boats, and all the ships sailed right past the fort without a shot being fired. Now, Robert Cyril was a friend of Henry Morgan's. He was one of those groups that had been with Henry Morgan way back under Christopher Mings. And now he was sailing as a pirate on his own. And he had heard in May of 1668 that a Spanish treasure ship had sunk off St. Augustine, and there was a huge amount of treasure being held there. He wanted it, so he decided to take it. He landed his force in St. Augustine, but saw this rather large and imposing fort. Anyone that's been to St. Augustine knows exactly what I'm talking about. And that would be too troublesome to try and take. So instead, he took what he could from the town and burned it. Now, when he got back to Port Royal, he found himself in a lot of trouble with the governor. Sure, he had letters of marque allowing him to attack Spanish ships, but the letters of marque did not allow him to attack Spanish ports. He had exceeded his authority. It was a very delicate balancing game that they were playing. They wanted to keep the Spanish tied up, but not make them too mad to go to war. So really, Henry Morgan was the only privateer allowed to attack Spanish cities. Robert Cyril was placed under arrest and spent the next year under house arrest. He was allowed to go and come as he chose, but he was not permitted to leave Port Royal until the governor decided what was to be done with him. Now, you've heard me mention Port Royal a lot. This is a map of the south part of Jamaica. You can see the city of Kingston dead center on the coast. Port Royal was a city on a little sandbar that stuck way out into the water. This is an enlargement, and they built 3 large forts to protect Port Royal because it was that important of a city. This is a picture of one of those forts that I took when I was in Port Royal doing research for my book. This is Fort Charles, built in 1655. And it's kind of interesting because Henry Morgan was one of the officer engineers that actually constructed that fort. And Port Royal was a busy seaport. Now, there were sugar plantations and mining operations all over the island. So you can imagine the wealth that came to Port Royal. There were 6,000 residents on that tiny little spit of land. That equals the population density of the most dense parts of New York City today. Every fifth building was a tavern or a brothel. More profits came out of Jamaica than all of the other English colonies combined. Now, one of the travelers said that it was the Sodom of the New World, and another person said it was the dunghill of the universe. But I don't really think so. I look at Port Royal as the Las Vegas of the day. No one was really in danger. I mean, certainly there was a lot of gambling going on, and if you thought women of ill repute and drinking was horrible, then you're gonna think Port Royal was horrible. But the people itself were actually very mild. This is an artist's conception of what Port Royal would have looked like. Now, something of interest is Port Royal religiously was one of the freest and most tolerant cities in the New World. In fact, it had the largest Jewish population of any city anywhere at the time. Jews were welcome because they were very good merchants and appreciated by the members of Port Royal. And the first synagogue in the New World was built on Port Royal. Now, while Henry Morgan was sitting thinking about what he was going to take next, he decided on the rich city of Panama. No one had ever really taken Panama before. And he got word that a treaty had been signed back in England between King Charles and the King of Spain. And this treaty forbade any more letters of marque to be issued and did not allow for any more privateers to take Spanish ships. But Morgan and the governor of Jamaica didn't believe they were serious. I mean, the Spanish were our enemies. They wouldn't really mean that we couldn't attack Spanish ships anymore. So the governor issued Henry Morgan his letters of marque, and he set off. Of course, he sailed to Tortuga first and recruited a force of 36 ships and 1,846 men, then sailed right for the Isthmus of Panama. When he landed at the Charges River and went up the river in small boats until he got over the mountains, and then formed outside the city in traditional military formation. Remember, he was a lieutenant in the army, so all of his attacks were more like army attacks, with soldiers in formation. He had drums beating and flags flying. Now this shows Henry Morgan's infantry formations on the right, and the Spanish, of course, being polite soldiers, came out to meet his formation, with them lined up in the white on the left. But the Spanish had a secret weapon that Henry didn't know about. Attack cattle. Their plan was to stampede the cattle into the English forces at just the opportune moment. Well, the battle began as usual with some volleys, minimal amount of casualties, and then Morgan's cavalry flanked the Spanish, but instead of shooting at the Spanish, shot at the cattle and stampeded the cattle into the Spanish forces, eliminating most of them. From then on, it was an easy mop-up operation. You can see the tower on the right is the only original structure left from the old city of 1670. And you can see that same tower in the contemporary drawing of Morgan attacking the city. Wound up this time with 400,000 pieces of eight, his richest prize throughout his entire career. Oh, he ordered Robert Cyril, though, to go down to the port. You see, he had found documents that a Spanish treasure fleet was due in any moment. But Robert Cyril was unlucky enough to spy a Spanish ship carrying a cargo of wine. And his entire crew got into the wine and drank it. So when the Spanish treasure fleet did arrive, His crew were too drunk to respond, and the Spanish treasure ship got away. Morgan was furious, never spoke to Robert Cyril again. Now, when Morgan returned to Port Royal in April of 1671, he returned to find that the governor had been arrested and relieved for issuing him those letters of marque. You see, him taking Panama created a national diplomatic incident. Morgan himself was arrested and sent off to the Tower of London. Well, we be halfway through our journey, and the captain will now answer any questions from any of the crew who be wanting to ask him.
Captain.
Yes.
Who won the 30 Years' War?
The Protestants did. It wound up being more of a draw. The war was primarily England, all of Eastern Europe, Slovakia, all of those, and all of the Protestant countries of Germany against Spain and France and the Dutch. And the French were on the side of the Spanish through most of it. And it just kind of, everybody ran out of resources. And I guess for the Eastern Europeans, they could say they won because they got to keep most of their land. Everything else just kind of went back to status quo.
Thank you. And one more question. What was going on with the slave trade during all this?
The slave trade up until 1670 was primarily a Portuguese-Spanish operation with a little bit of the Dutch. But the Portuguese actually were the ones that started the slave trade. They had all of the slave trading ports, and they would send most of their slaves to Cape Verde Islands for processing, and then they would be sold from the Cape Verdes to the Spanish, to the French, to the Dutch, whoever they wanted it. England was actually a very late entry into it. Starting in 1672, England needed money, and they decided, you know, slavery is a good way to get it. So they started attacking some of these slave ports in Africa and converting them to English slave ports. But at this time, when Morgan took Panama, it was a Dutch operation almost exclusively.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, a Portuguese operation. Very well. We shall carry on. So there's Henry Morgan. He's a little older now. He's been in the Tower of London for 2 years. Now, when you say a prisoner in the Tower of London, one thinks of a dungeon with chains, damp, musty, moldy, terrible food. Not so with Henry Morgan. He had a 6-room suite with servants, and he was permitted out during the day. He just had to be back by evening, except on the weekends when he was allowed to stay out overnight. And during this time, he worked very hard to recruit a lot of friends and allies that were on the inner circle with the King of England, King Charles. Well, 2 years later, guess what? Spain went back on their word and broke the treaty and started attacking English ports all throughout the Caribbean. What was the king going to do? Who knew how to deal with the Spanish? Well, his friend said there's only one man that knows how to deal with the Spanish, and that's Henry Morgan. So Henry Morgan was released, knighted, made governor of Jamaica, and sent back to fix the problem. You can imagine the ceremony when he arrived in Jamaica and relieved the governor that had arrested him 2 years earlier. Must have been most awkward. Now, I saw a show on the History Channel that said, where did Henry Morgan bury his treasure? And I thought that was one of the most ridiculous things I had ever heard of. Making it out as if Henry Morgan was some low-life, second-rate pirate that had to hide his treasure on the beach. During this time period of his life, he was the governor of Jamaica. He also owned 3 of the largest sugar plantations on the island. One of them is still in existence. So he probably buried his treasure in the bank. Now, everything was going well for Morgan until 1678, when Alexander Escamillan published a book called The American Sea Rover, or in Dutch, The Amerikaanse Zeerovers, with a lot of horrible stories about Henry Morgan. You see, Alexander Escamillan claims to have been a member of Morgan's crew, surgeon, as a matter of fact, and knew Morgan intimately and talked about all the horrible atrocities that Morgan did while he was a captain. That he used nuns and priests as human shields when he attacked cities. That he tortured all of his captives to find out where their loot was. That's a lot of nasty things. And that Henry Morgan did not come to America as a lieutenant, but merely as an indentured servant of low rank. Well, in 1682, the English version was published, and Henry Morgan read it. He was outraged. Now, I've got to mention something about why Escamillan would write a book like this. Why would he lie? Well, at the time he wrote it, England and Holland were at war again. And any book that talks about how bad the English were was a bestseller. So he was writing a bestseller and inventing stories in order to sell his book. And when Morgan found out about it, he was outraged. And he acted like you'd expect a buccaneer to do, a man of action, an admiral, a colonel, a soldier of fortune. He sued him for slander in a court of law and won. All the books had to come off the shelf, but when Henry Morgan died a few years later, they came back on the shelves. In fact, it's still in print today. If you go buy a book about Henry Morgan, you'll buy a version of this book with all of those stories of atrocities and cruelty that never happened. Now, one last thing about Henry Morgan. Of course, you know of Captain Morgan's rum that's theoretically named for Henry Morgan. Rum was invented 3 years after Henry Morgan died. He never tasted it. The next person I'd like to talk about is William Dampier, the Buccaneer author. Most people have never heard of him, but yet he is one of the most important and prominent figures in the history of pirates. Now, he was an honest sailor off the north coast of Jamaica when his ship was captured by a fleet of pirates. These weren't privateers with letters of marque. These were pirates, no doubt pirates, English and French. Now, as usual with pirates, when they would capture a ship, they would ask, "Does anybody want to join our crew? Everyone's welcome." And in William Dampier's case, he said no, he didn't want to be a pirate, but everyone else did. And he was left alone on the vessel. Well, he didn't feel like being stranded in the Caribbean for months, so he went along. He joined Captain Edmund Cook's crew. And their quartermaster was a man named Edward Davis. Now, they had a total of 9 ships with 477 buccaneers. And they took the city of Portobello. It wasn't quite as rich as when Henry Morgan took it, but they still got a decent take. And they ran into the Mosquito Indians, the local inhabitants of the Isthmus of Panama. They hated the Spanish. And they were delighted to escort the pirates across the isthmus so that they could attack ships in Panama. But this wasn't the kind of buccaneers that Henry Morgan knew. They were selfish, self-centered, argued constantly among themselves, were fighting over who got to be the senior captain, and it was just a terrible experience for William Dampier. They didn't get very much, and when they returned, they saw that all of their ships were gone. They left them there thinking they'd be there when they got back, but they weren't. So the pirates kind of begged passage off of whatever ship they could find that was passing by. And William Dampier went different ways from his captain, Edmund Cook and Edward Davis, but not for long. Accomack, Virginia. That is the Delaware, Maryland, Virginia peninsula that comes down, if you're familiar with the east coast of the United States, Washington, D.C. would be up there at the top of the Chesapeake Bay. Accomack is a small community close to the Maryland border on Virginia. And for a long time, that was a spot where pirates would go to careen their vessels. Now, surprisingly as it sounds, careening is where you haul the entire ship up onto the beach to clean it. You see, ships get all kinds of growth underneath, barnacles, seaweed, all kinds of other things that slow the ship down. Slow and pirate is bad. Plus, if you didn't clean it off every several months, eventually your ship would start to leak and sink. So you had to careen your vessels. And that's a dangerous time because you're vulnerable to attack from anyone. So you had to find a quiet location where you could safely careen your ships, and the locals would bring you food, drink, whatever supplies you may need. And Accomac was that place. For decades, the locals quietly kept that as the place to go to careen your vessels in safety. Of course, this was highly illegal, but the local inhabitants were making a fortune. They would be able to sell their food to the pirates that stopped by at maybe 6, 7, 8 times the regular market. The pirates didn't care. They're careening in safety. And Edward Davis was in Accomac careening when William Dampier got word that he was there and traveled and met up with his old captain and joined the crew. From there, they sailed around Cape Horn and started taking prizes all along the Pacific coast of South and North America. Pretty soon, they were joined by a bunch of other pirates, and they had a little pirate fleet going. One of the most effective pirate fleets in the operation because they were taking the Spanish treasure fleets that were coming into Panama. They stopped at the Galapagos Islands. In fact, William Dampier is the first person to ever record the existence of the Galapagos Islands. And they made their base on the Cocos Islands, where they buried all of their treasure. Why would they do that? Well, think about a huge amount of treasure on a pirate ship. Gold is heavy. Heavy makes your ship slow. So the more treasure you have, the slower your ships. Plus, if you happen to lose one ship in a battle, you've lost a year's worth of work. So they would stop and bury their treasure on that island until they were ready to go home. Then they stopped by and picked it all up. So don't buy a ticket to the Cocos Islands. There's no treasure left. They got it all. Well, eventually the captain died, probably of scurvy, and Edward Davis took over as the new captain. Well, he had had enough, wanted to go home. And William Dampier wasn't quite finished with the adventure of a lifetime. So he joined one of the other crews, and they separated again. This time for the last time. Now, Dampier wound up making a round-the-world voyage with this other crew. But these pirates weren't like his other friend Davis. They were drunk, uncouth, they constantly fought, smelly, unfriendly. He was having a terrible time. So when he got as far as the Nicobar Islands, he quietly jumped ship and waited till he could find passage back to England on a merchant ship. When he got back, he wrote it all down in a book he had published. And when I say all, I mean all. Every single piratical action they did, every ship they took, how much treasure they got, the enormous value of information that came from William Dampier is fabulous. But also, he kept highly detailed, accurate records of the plant life, the animal life, the climate, the natives. He put all of this in his book. The first to describe the Galapagos, the first person to describe Australia. Now, one would think if a pirate published a book admitting all of his crimes that he would be arrested. Not Dampier. His book was a bestseller. And soon he was lecturing at all of the major universities in England as the world's leading authority on world naturalism. Now I must sidestep for a moment to talk about James Edward Stewart, who was born in June 1688. And this is going to be a bit boring, but it's important. And it sets up the events for the rest of the story of our pirates. You see, James's father was James II, King of England from 1685 to 1688. He was a bad king and not well liked, And his first wife was Anne Hyde. He had 2 children, a daughter Mary and a daughter Anne. But then Anne Hyde died and he remarried Mary of Modena. She was Italian. She was Catholic. And he converted to Catholicism in order to marry her. The English didn't like that. They had fought a war 100 years earlier to get Catholics out. Remember King Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth, and all of that. And when he had a Catholic son, that was too much. That meant that when James died, his son could become King of England and try and bring back the Catholic faith. So let's step back a little bit and see all of the family relations. Here you have King Charles, that's his dad, and his brother Charles I over there on the left, and his sister Mary, who married William II of the Dutch Republic and had a son named William III. And then he had his son James, who had a daughter Mary and Anne, and then the other son James. Okay, there's the whole family tree. Well, if you're going to rule out James II of King and nullify his son, who does that leave you with? That leaves you with them. And they became invited over to become King and Queen of England, which caused a war known as the Glorious Revolution. Now, when William came to England with a large force of 11,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, one might think that the English would try and resist this somehow. Quite the contrary. Most England hated James. So they set up a parade, and they paraded cheering and welcoming William all the way from the docks to Whitehall. William and Mary co-equally ruled as King and Queen of England. Now, the War of the Grand Alliance started in 1689, lasted almost 10 years, mainly between England and France. But the Dutch were, of course, on the side of the English because the King of England was also the King of the Dutch. And Spain, surprisingly, jumped in on the side of the English. Well, they were kind of mad at France over some land that they'd been fighting over in the Netherlands for quite a while. Now I take you to Hampton, Virginia in the summer of 1688. Hampton, Virginia is next to the modern city of Norfolk, Virginia Beach, entrance to the James River. And a small boat with 4 people were quietly rowing through the waters on a dark night at about 2 in the morning. There they go. When they accidentally ran into the HMS Deptford, a patrol ship under command of Captain Simon Rowe. Now, we thought the little rowboat looked odd. What are they doing out here at 2 in the morning, rowing in the middle of Hampton Roads? He thought it was suspicious, so he ordered them to heave to and inspected their boat, and found hidden under the blankets 6,000 pounds of gold and silver coins. This was not usual. So they were arrested and taken back to the city of Hampton, which, by the way, was where the Royal Navy's headquarters were for the entire Atlantic coast. Now, at first, they were going to be tried for smuggling, which was what they were most concerned about. But they were aware of a law that pirates had to be tried by the Admiralty. At that time, piracy fell under the jurisdiction of the Admiralty, and the only Admiralty court was in England. By the way, one of those 4 men was Edward Davis, the captain of William Dampier's pirate ship and William Dampier's old friend. So, with them insisting they be tried for piracy, off to London they went. Had to find a good lawyer, and they think they found one. A man named James Blair was in London trying to raise money for a special project he had back in Virginia. James Blair was a reverend and a lawyer from Virginia and was used to the Virginia laws and was well respected in the colonies. Plus, he was a fabulous lawyer. You could just hear him pleading their court. My lords, the evidence against my clients are merely circumstantial. Honest seamen, they came about this fortune in honest trade, and just happened by chance to be there in the evening. It was beyond their ability to control. And guess what? They got off scot-free with all of their money returned to them. Under two conditions. They had to pay £300 legal fees to James Blair, but they had to make a generous donation of £2,000 to Blair's special project. What was that project? The founding of the College of William and Mary, founded on pirate booty and legal fees. Well, in the 1690s, the Caribbean was kind of played out, and no one was really having much success there. But there was the Indian Ocean. Vast amounts of fortune could be captured in the Indian Ocean if only you could get there. You see, it was too long a voyage for a pirate ship. The East India Company could get there because they had islands with refitting stations set up all along the way, where ships could stop and take on fresh water, fresh supplies, careen a little bit, and carry on. Pirates couldn't do that. Not until a man named Adam Baldrige got the brilliant idea of creating a pirate base. Now, he originally was from the state of New York, got into some kind of trouble, was wanted for murder, something like that, and had to flee quickly. And he sailed to Madagascar and set up a small base on the island of St. Mary's. Now, pirates could stop there and resupply, and the first one to do so was Thomas Tew, a pirate originally from Rhode Island, but was now operating out of Bermuda. He stopped and refitted and took ships all in the Indian Ocean, rich, huge treasure ships, and then sailed back to New York. Now, in New York, Thomas Tew was welcomed as a hero. See, New York really didn't care that his merchandise were coming from ships that he had robbed at sea. New York merchants were desperate for things to sell to their clients. And he was providing silk, spices, gems, jewels, just about anything you wanted, duty-free. He became good friends with the governor of New York, the toast of the town. The governor would hold parties and people could come and meet the famous pirate, Thomas Tew. And for a while, New York became a very pirate-friendly port. So did pirates always terrorize the ports they landed in? Not really. Most ports welcomed pirates. England had so much restriction on what could be traded that merchants couldn't get good material. They couldn't get silverware. They couldn't get anything imported in the way of china. Most of their products had to be made in the colonies, and they were crude. Well, merchants wanted to sell to their plantation owners who were making a fortune selling tobacco and sugarcane. And the only way they could get those products were from pirates. So generally, when a pirate ship came into port during the 1690s, everyone was thrilled. And the pirates came ashore dressed as pirates, but friendly pirates, and spent their money. Not only did the merchants sell or buy all the products' goods, but then they enjoyed taking that money right back from the pirates when they spent it in their taverns. Now, of course, some of the main pirate ports started off in Jamaica and Tortuga, as we've already talked about. But Jamaica, or Port Royal, was totally destroyed by an earthquake in 1692, never to recover. So the pirate-friendly ports had to shift elsewhere. The first main port was Charlestown, a brand new settlement in what is now South Carolina that became one of the most friendly pirate ports of the day. New York was the other. Now, Thomas Tew went back to sea and met another man named Henry Every, and they became partners and made one of the biggest contributions of any pirate. You see, in the 17th century, they used flags to represent different things. Of course, the white flag means I surrender. Everyone knows that. We still use that today. The yellow flag meant there was disease on board. The black flag was the flag of death. But the red flag meant I'm not going to take any prisoners. In other words, no quarter is going to be given. This was a military flag used by the armies of Europe at the time and also used by naval vessels. Now, pirates would raise that flag. In other words, saying, surrender to us now and you'll be okay. Because if we have to fight you, we're going to kill you all. Very seldom did they ever do that, but that was the threat. Now, the French used to call this the happy red flag. You can just see the French saying that, oh, let's go raise the happy red flag. And of course, in French, that would be the Gilet Rouge, which is why the English buccaneers started calling it the Jolly Roger. Well, Every and Thomas too had their red flags also, but at some point they thought, that's a bit plain, let's decorate them. And they decorated their flags with white emblems so that people would recognize who is coming at them. And they realized, we're really not going to kill everybody, so the red flag doesn't really have its meaning. Let's make them black flags instead, the black flag of death. Plus, it looks better against the blue sky. And the pirate flag is born. Later on, every pirate would have his own distinctive designed pirate flag, thanks to Thomas II and Henry Every. Well, eventually Thomas II was killed in a raid in September of 1695, and Every decided to retire. It is believed that he bought a mansion in Ireland and lived out the rest of his life in luxury. I get a lot of questions about what pirates ate. Many people think, oh, pirates were starving all of the time. They were ill-fed. Not so. In fact, pirates ate pretty well. You imagine they took a ship every day, they would have fresh food, whatever was aboard that ship, every time they took one. Now, some of the standard stuff that sailors ate was hardtack, which is kind of like an entire box of saltines compressed into one cracker, and oats and peas and cheese and salted meat of any kind. But they also had live goats and pigs on board their ships. Most of the civilian ships carried them too. So when they took a civilian ship, they'd have fresh goat cheese, and they would also have fresh bacon. A lot of turkeys and chickens were kept aboard ships, so they would always have fowl to eat. In fact, there was an accounting that Hal Davis took the cheese, turkeys, fowl, and ducks and made a feast. And they cooked them mostly into stews and soups. That's a picture of a stove that's actually aboard an 17th century vessel. So they would make a little fire right below decks with a chimney, and they were able to cook up very good meals on board ship. They also ate a lot of turtles. But they had fruit too. There's accounts of bananas, plantains, oranges, limes, coconuts, and pineapples on board many of the Spanish ships as they were leaving port, which of course the Spanish took and would get the food. I want to mention something about pineapples, which are native to the Bahamas, actually, not Hawaii, like most people believe. The pineapple became one of the most coveted fruits of all time, but they spoil rather quickly. So in order to get fresh pineapples to Europe, you had to have a very fast ship that went directly there. King Charles loved pineapples so much that he would send his fastest ships to the Bahamas regularly just for pineapples and make the trip back. Because they were so rare, they became very expensive. So offering someone pineapple was a sign of the ultimate friendship, which is why you see the pineapple motif so often in colonial America on doors and plates and things as a sign of wealth and friendship. But they also ate a lot of avocados, which are native to the Caribbean. In fact, they were called midshipman's butter along with many of the crews. Now, when they started taking Spanish ships, Spanish cuisine started coming into the English cuisine. Things like olives and olive oil that the Spanish used a lot of, pasta and rice, garlic and onions, vinegar and pickled vegetables. So as an English vessel was taking Spanish prizes, they would have access to all of those food goods. Ashore, their food would have been cooked like this. While they were careening their vessels, set up a little campfire and make your stews in cookware right on the beach. Now, two things of interest are tomatoes and potatoes. Both native to South America, they were main staples of the Inca Indians and were introduced to Europe by the Spanish. Now, the thing about the potato is people really didn't like them. They thought they were poisonous. The potato took off well in Eastern Europe during the 30 Years' War because during that war, armies would burn a lot of the crops to try and wipe out a community. But potatoes were under the ground and survived the fire. So for a while, potatoes were the only food you could get in Eastern Europe, which is one reason why the German people seemed to put potatoes in everything. Tomatoes, a little bit more suspicious. When the tomatoes were introduced to England, they were believed to be poisonous, but not so among the Italians and among the Spanish. And there's an interesting theory about that. Tomatoes are very acidic, and the Spanish and the Italians were either rich or poor. If you were poor, you ate on wooden plates. If you were rich, you ate on silver plates. The acid doesn't bother you. But the middle-class English used a lot of pewter that was made with lead. And the acid in the tomatoes reacted with the pewter and gave you lead poisoning. So it's possible they got that reputation of being poisonous among the English for that reason. Now, back to the pirates. The famous Captain William Kidd. He started his career in 1688 in the Caribbean as a privateer during the war, and did very well, and took his fortune to the city of New York. That's actually a sketch of William Kidd's house in New York. Now you notice the little fort and stockade at the end of the road? His house was right next to that. And that was a defensive wall that was built all around the city for defense against the Indians or whoever else might attack. And there was a road that ran right alongside that wall called Wall Street. William Kidd knew about all of the piratical acts that were going on in the Indian Ocean. The East India Company was being raided. Of course, England and France were at war, and maybe he could get some letters of marque, and there were all these pirates out there. So he went to the Lord Bellomonto, who is governor of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and asked him to introduce him to the King of England himself and get letters of marque to attack enemy shipping in the Indian Ocean. And the king agreed and gave him a galley. Most people don't think of galleys still being operational, but they were quite common in the late 18th century, late 17th century at the time. So he sailed for the Indian Ocean and arrived in April of 1697. But almost an entire year had gone by and he hadn't sighted a single vessel. His crew was on the verge of mutiny. Everyone was antsy. And then in February 1698, he spotted this huge merchant ship, the Quita Merchant, the richest prize ever captured, and he took it. The one problem is, it wasn't French. It belonged to the Mogul of India, which was an ally of Great Britain. Secondly, the captain was English. Oops. So what's he going to do? How can he talk himself out of this? Well, he rummaged through the ship and he found a French document. The French had given this ship a free pass through their lines, so none of the French privateers were allowed to take it. Aha, that's it. They're in league with the French. Therefore, I'm going to claim that this is truly a French ship and therefore a legal prize for me to take, according to my letters of marque. Problem is, the war in England and France was over, and his letters of marque were no longer valid. William Kidd did not know this, so he sailed back to Adam Baldrige's base in Madagascar, and he stayed there several months, long enough for him to make a trip to the South China Seas to bury some of his treasure, as he later claimed. Then he burned his adventure galley. Well, it was kind of old and leaking anyway. And he sailed back to the Caribbean in the Quita Merchant, arriving in Antigua. There, he learned that he was the #1 pirate in the world. News of him taking the Indian merchant ship had created a diplomatic incident. Everybody wanted William's head. What's he going to do? He takes the Queen merchant to Catalina Island and buries some more treasure and sinks it and hires a small sloop to take him back to New York. The Queen merchant was recently discovered off Catalina Island. No treasure on board. Now, back in New York, he immediately contacted the governor, Earl of Bellamont, and he gave him that letter. Oh, you could talk me out of this. Please explain this to the king, and I'll be glad to make my shares with you. It was too late for that. He was arrested and taken back to London, and the French letter mysteriously vanished. And Lord Bellamont claimed he had no knowledge of any French letter whatsoever. Now, Kidd tried to save himself by saying, I've got treasure buried in the South China Seas. I've got treasure buried in the Caribbean. I even have treasure buried in New York. You let me go, and I'll lead you to it. But the authorities didn't buy it. And Kidd was executed on the 23rd of May, 1701. Later, on Long Island, they found 20,000 pounds buried. And then Churchill and Howe, who were two of Kidd's crewmen, managed to bribe the guards to let them go. And they returned and dug up another 1,500 pounds on Gardner Island and 700 pounds on Block Island. So clearly, Kidd did have treasure buried there. And then in the 1920s, a mysterious map showed up, a treasure map that supposedly belonged to Kidd. See, Captain Kidd had a wooden chest with him that he actually gave to a guard in prison before he was executed. The guard kept the chest in his family and eventually sold it to an antique dealer, but found a false bottom in that chest, and this map is in the bottom of that. Well, maybe it's genuine, maybe it's a forgery from the antique dealer. No one really knows. The map disappeared sometime in the 1950s and can no longer be examined. So, did pirates bury their treasure? Why would? You talk to most historians and they'll say, pirates really never buried their treasure. Oh, Captain Kidd did. That's documented. He's the only one. I disagree. There are 3 good reasons why pirates would bury their treasure. First is to reduce the king's share. Remember, you got that 25% if you're a privateer. So if you don't want to split the full amount, you stop somewhere quietly, bury some treasure, come back and say, we had a good time, we didn't make quite as much. And then after you've settled with the king, you go back and dig up the rest. If you don't believe privateers would do that, then you don't believe people would cheat on their income tax. The second reason, if you're far from home, as we saw with William Dampier and Edward Davis, if you're operating a long way from home, you can't keep all that treasure on one ship. You stop off somewhere and bury it until it's time to go home, and you go back and you pick it up, unless you're sunk. But the third reason is to avoid customs. Now, if you're sailing into a port that's not a pirate-friendly port, and you have some merchandise, let's say some silk to sell, you know the customs inspectors are going to be looking to inspect your ship as soon as you arrive. You can't explain all the gold and silver coins you've got, so you stop off somewhere and bury them, go in and sell your merchandise, and go back and pick them up. That's exactly what John Quelch did in 1704. He was approaching, on his way to Marblehead, stopped off at Star Island and buried his coins, then went on into Marblehead. Unfortunately, he was recognized. He and his crew were arrested, and he was hanged. 130 years later, some farmer was doing renovations to a stone wall, and all those silver and gold coins poured out behind a couple of bricks. You never know, there might be treasure out there. Thank you.